Let's talk about the Liberation Day tariffs, a policy that sounded more like a blockbuster movie than a serious economic strategy. The name alone conjured images of dramatic showdowns and high-stakes battles, but this was no Hollywood script. It was a real-world gamble with the global economy at stake. On April 2, 2025, former President Trump declared America's ballooning trade deficit an unusual and extraordinary threat to national security. Using language usually reserved for wartime emergencies, he invoked sweeping emergency powers to impose a blanket 10% tariff on nearly all imports, an unprecedented move in modern U.S. history. For countries like China, the tariffs would be matched to whatever rates they imposed on American goods, essentially, playground rules applied to international trade, but with consequences that could ripple through the global economy and disrupt supply chains worldwide. The legal tool behind this bold move, the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA. Originally designed to sanction rogue states and freeze assets during national emergencies, it was now being stretched to justify a sweeping rewrite of U.S. trade policy, something Congress had never intended. The administration claimed these tariffs would liberate the U.S. economy from unfair trade deals, protect American jobs, and restore manufacturing might. Supporters hailed it as a bold stand for American workers and industries that had long felt left behind. But economists across the spectrum warned that tariffs are, in effect, taxes paid by U.S. importers, costs that are almost always passed on to American consumers. Everyday goods from electronics to groceries would become more expensive, hitting families and businesses alike. This marked a sharp and dramatic break from decades of bipartisan free trade policy, risking not just higher prices at home but also the possibility of a global trade war. Allies and rivals alike watched nervously, bracing for retaliation and economic fallout. The Liberation Day branding tried to frame what was essentially a sweeping tax hike as an act of patriotic defiance. But beneath the slogans and speeches, the legal foundation for this move was shaky at best, raising serious questions about presidential power. And that shaky foundation was about to face a major test in court, as legal challenges mounted and the nation waited to see if this economic gamble would stand or collapse under judicial scrutiny. The backlash was immediate and intense. 12 Democratic-led states and a coalition of small businesses quickly filed lawsuits, arguing that the president's move was not only unprecedented but also unconstitutional. Their case hinged on a fundamental principle: only Congress has the authority to regulate foreign commerce and impose tariffs, as outlined in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. They contended that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, was designed for targeted sanctions, not for a sweeping overhaul of trade policy that could affect the entire economy. The legal battle invoked the non-delegation doctrine, which asserts that Congress cannot delegate its core legislative powers to another branch of government. Additionally, the major questions doctrine was cited, which requires clear congressional approval for actions of vast economic significance. Plaintiffs argued that using IEPA to impose trillions of dollars in new tariffs was a textbook example of a major question that necessitated explicit legislative approval. The administration, led by Attorney General Pam Bondi, countered by insisting that the president had broad authority to counter foreign threats, including trade deficits, under his executive powers. They framed the tariffs as a decisive action necessary for safeguarding national security and protecting American interests. The stage was set for a monumental constitutional showdown over who ultimately controls America's trade policy, the president or Congress. The stakes were incredibly high, involving not just the limits of presidential power but also the future direction of U.S. trade policy and its impact on the global economy. The U.S. Court of International Trade wasted no time in issuing a decisive ruling against the administration's controversial tariff move, finding that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, did not grant the president the sweeping authority to impose tariffs at will. The court emphasized that Congress had crafted IEPA for specific targeted emergencies, such as national security threats, not as a tool for broad economic policy or trade disputes. This decision was a significant victory for states and businesses who had argued that the administration's actions threatened their livelihoods. It was also a sharp and public rebuke to what many saw as executive overreach. But the fight was far from over. The administration quickly appealed, and while the legal battle continued, the tariffs remained in place, leaving businesses, importers, and exporters in a costly and uncertain limbo. At the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, a panel of judges pressed the government's lawyers with tough questions. Could any president simply declare any economic issue an emergency and impose sweeping tariffs, they asked? The skepticism in the courtroom was unmistakable. Judges appeared deeply concerned about the possibility of unchecked executive power and the precedent such a move could set for future administrations. As both sides braced for a potential Supreme Court showdown, they knew the stakes had never been higher. The outcome would not only affect tariffs but could redefine the very boundaries of presidential authority and the separation of powers. The legal journey had sharpened the arguments, brought new urgency to the debate, and raised the stakes for everyone involved, from lawmakers to business owners. Only the Supreme Court, the nation's highest judicial authority, could ultimately settle this historic constitutional clash. As the nation watched and waited, the final answer would shape the balance of power for years to come. The Supreme Court took up the case, recognizing its massive implications for trade and executive authority. In a 6-3 decision, the court struck down the Liberation Day tariffs, ruling the president had overstepped. The majority said IEPA didn't authorize a sweeping new tariff regime. Congress would have to be much clearer to delegate that power. The court leaned on the major questions doctrine. Transforming trade policy requires explicit congressional approval. The message: if you want to rewrite trade law, go to Congress. The dissenters warned this could limit future presidents' flexibility, but the majority's check on executive power stood. The decision reaffirmed Congress's constitutional role in trade. It was a defining moment for the balance of power in Washington. The Supreme Court's decision immediately ended the Liberation Day tariffs, relief for importers and eventually consumers. U.S. trade policy now returns to a more stable, Congress-driven process, ending years of tariff uncertainty. Trading partners can breathe easier. No more sudden unilateral tariff hikes. The ruling curtails the president's power to use emergency laws for sweeping economic changes. Future presidents must seek specific congressional approval for major trade actions. The decision also helps de-escalate global trade tensions, reducing the risk of retaliatory tariffs. The president still has tools for targeted tariffs, but not for rewriting the entire tariff code. The global economy gets a chance to stabilize and rebuild trust. The ruling doesn't solve every trade dispute, but it removes a major source of chaos. It's a win for predictability, the rule of law, and the separation of powers. The major questions doctrine is now a central check on executive power. It says, for decisions of huge national impact, agencies need clear, specific instructions from Congress. The Supreme Court used this doctrine to block the tariffs, saying IEPA's vague language wasn't enough. The message: Congress must authorize big, transformative actions, not the president alone. This doctrine is reshaping the balance of power, forcing major policy debates back into Congress. It's already limited executive action on climate and now on trade. Agencies and presidents can't stretch old laws to fit new ambitions. The Constitution's design, debate, compromise, and accountability, takes center stage again. With the tariffs gone, importers are lining up for refunds, a bureaucratic nightmare that could take years. For consumers, lower prices on imported goods will come, but not overnight. Retailers need to clear old inventory first. The White House can't use IEPA for sweeping tariffs anymore. Future trade fights must go through Congress. This means more public debate, more transparency, and fewer sudden shocks to the economy. The case was about more than prices. It was a test of constitutional limits. The Supreme Court's answer: only Congress can impose nationwide taxes by emergency decree. It's a victory for the rule of law and democratic accountability. In America, not even the president gets to be king, and that's a principle that protects us all.